Let's take a first short-term and then long-term perspective. China is still, at least for the next 15, 20 years, heavily dependent on coal. What can they do more to make this cleaner? Can they, I mean, there are different standards which I gather are unevenly enforced across the country. These are very local producers by and large. We're not talking about a kind of a national grid that is controlled centrally in Beijing, but hundreds and thousands of local coal-fired plants. Do you see progress there in terms of just in environmental collection, cleaning them up in a way so that as mercury comes out, or what?
I think that they're doing some smart things. For example, they're closing. I mean, the efficiency of a coal-fired power plant can be as low as 18%, 15%. That's the amount of the coal energy that's produced, that's turned into electricity, or as high as 30 or 40%. So what they've been doing is closing down the really inefficient, dirty coal-fired power plants, and at the same time building more big ones that are really actually more efficient. So that's at least a step in the right direction. But you also have to move aggressively to this new energy system, in which coal is going to be, it's going to be phased out. It has to be phased out, otherwise, the climate issue will get worse. What's happening in the U.S. I think is interesting at the moment. We're actually phasing out coal. And we're phasing out coal in part because of steps taken by the EPA.
Right, most recently.
Without support from
President Obama.
And we're also doing it because the economics actually favors closing down coal-fired power plants because natural gas is cheap. So
you're clearly not running for election in West Virginia.
No,
or
I'm not
Pennsylvania.
So if in fact we want to deal with the issue, so we are actually reducing CO2 emissions in the U.S. in a significant way. We're actually almost back to where we were in the 1990s, which is pretty amazing. And if we're going to actually continue to make progress, in the U.S. we have to build up the renewable side of this thing. Coal has to disappear, has to be replaced by wind and solar. Now, replacing natural gas with wind depends on the price of natural gas. I would actually be in favor of natural gas prices being a little higher than they are in the U.S. And that way wind could compete without having subsidies on either side. How could we actually deal with this issue? One way, I would be in favor of the U.S. becoming a net exporter of natural gas to China. So that would be good for both countries, in my opinion. It would help the Chinese clean up their air quality. It would be better than using dirty coal, and it would make natural gas prices slightly higher in the U.S., which would make renewables competitive. We need global issues, global analysis to deal with these issues.
Now, the Russians have just signed a very large gas deal with China. You see this having a significant impact on China's energy consumption?
Yes, it will. I mean, I think that getting natural gas from the Russians, particularly if they made a good deal on the price, is obviously a step forward. But I don't think it's going to. I don't think the Chinese see it as the end of their energy problem. I think that they see that they are going to have to rely on LNG imports, liquefied natural gas imports, and they're building the ports to receive that. And I would be in favor of the U.S. becoming a net supplier.
China is importing natural gas from a lot of places. It's importing it by pipeline from Central Asia. It's also importing it from Myanmar. And I think this deal with Russia is substantially motivated, at least partly motivated by the environmental benefits of burning gas instead of coal for the reasons that Mike's described. There is one thing that I think you have to be concerned about in terms of a huge transition or a substantial transition towards natural gas use in China, including potentially fracking. So there's a big question about how much shale gas China has. There's some gigantic numbers out there. There's been some difficulty getting some wells started, and there's various aspects of geology. They say both above ground and below ground constraints, but there is some possibility that China
water issues
and water issues in certain areas. There is some possibility that China could have a lot of shale gas, and I would expect that the government is going to pull out the stops to find out, to try and solve the problems as much as it can. But there is an important issue that you have to think about when it comes to the climate implications of this. One, it has to do with the the carbon benefit of burning gas instead of coal. It has roughly half the carbon per unit energy delivered, so it's better in terms of CO2 emissions. But natural gas is substantially methane, and methane is also a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. In fact, a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So there's a question, this is a question in the U.S. too, in terms of shifting towards more and more reliance on natural gas, is how much leakage is there from the system, from the exploitation stage, through the pipelines, through the end use of methane into the atmosphere. And there's a certain amount of leakage, which is imaginable in places. People are debating what this level is in the United States. Whether or not there's actually a climate benefit of shifting to gas or not, you have to have a tight system. You have to make sure that there's not too much methane being released. And that's a question in terms of how China develops, for instance, its domestic gas reserves. Is it going to be able to do it in a way that this potential fugitive methane is captured? Otherwise, it can help clean up the air in some respect, or contribute to cleaning up the air, although Mike would say it's not enough. But it could have a downside for climate. So that's a big question, and I think China will be scrutinized over that if it does end up trying to exploit its natural gas.
I think that the so-called shale revolution is really, it has revolutionized energy issues in the United States, and it's likely to have an impact in other places. The jury's out on whether China has significant natural gas from shale, but where the jury is not out is that China is not going to significantly develop that resource in less than 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, the infrastructure required to do that is enormous. And you mentioned the problem of water. The problem of water is a very, very serious issue for China, because it's not just water for hydroelectric generation. You need water to run coal-fired power plants, and you need water for agriculture, and China is water scarce, and likely to become even more water scarce in the future.
Not in this part of China.
Not in this part, but in the northern part,
shortly to our north.
And even if you look at the generation of electricity from hydro in Three Gorges and in the Yangtze, upper regions of the Yangtze, it's got a very significant seasonal variation.
Sure.
It's low in winter, it's high in summer. And as I mentioned, in 2011, the summer peak was 50% lower than it was before.
So let me ask you, if you look to the future here, we have historical examples of horrifically polluted cities and countries that now seem clean.
Yeah.
London has lousy weather, but it doesn't have the deathly smog of the 1950s. Los Angeles, the Dodgers can again play under comparatively blue skies, which for a number of decades they couldn't, in that kind of orange mist that you would, or cloud that you would always see every time flying into LAX. I'm thinking of a place where when I was a graduate student, I lived in Taiwan, and Taiwan was rapidly developing then, like China is today. Very heavy particulate matter. I had a little balcony which I would sweep up the pollution dust every morning, and I'd get a lot of it outdoors. You could never see the mountains, the beautiful mountains around Taipei, except when a typhoon came through, and that's not a really helpful way of doing that. Today, Taiwan seems comparatively pristine. It's enormous progress has been made. I remember rural rivers being totally dirty and polluted, and this is the late 70s, early 80s. Now they are absolutely pristine. And Taiwan has a green movement, not just politically, and although it's had an impact, because it has an opposition party that has pushed this agenda very hard, but nevertheless, the government has also embraced it, and Taiwan, compared to any part of mainland China, does seem to have made enormous progress. And so my sense is, there are certain similarities in regimes here, both the importance of engineering and talent in the leadership, and a lot of scientific talent in Taiwan's leadership, today also in China's leadership. Can this here on the mainland, this government of engineers, turn this around? My own hope is that if any country has the capacity to turn around problems of the scope of China's, it actually is China's government. So,
Yeah, well, you know, if you think about, so how did London solve London's problem? What it did was to say, okay, initially it said, you may not burn dirty coal meaning coal that produces soot. So you have to burn what they call smokeless fuel. So that's higher grade coal that doesn't have a lot of particulate matter. And people kept doing it. And then after a while, they found they had another problem. The problem was acidification of the streams. And that was clearly coming from that, you know, clean coal that was, and so then the decision was that you had to stop people burning coal, period, in their houses. You had to have central heating and not, and so, you know, they made that transition, and now the air is, as you said, is relatively clean. You know, we did the same kind of thing in U.S. cities. Pittsburgh, for example, when I first went to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh was as dirty as Belfast was where I grew up. Pittsburgh is now clean. I mean, the buildings were black when I went there in the 60s.
and that's just because, not because the steel industry has moved to Asia?
No, it isn't. It's because, in fact, what they've done is to cut down on the particular emissions. You know, the Clean Air Act in 1970, Nixon's
Yes.
major achievement, made a big difference to the obvious implications of air pollution. I think that it's relatively easy to deal with a localized problem by investing significant resources, by changing your fuel mix, by investing in reducing the emissions, the conventional emissions from fuel mix. But if you have to do that for 1.3 billion people who are consuming already more coal than any other part of the world, that's a hell of a lot harder problem.
So you're not so optimistic.
So, I believe it would be a mistake to understate exactly how big that problem is. To make that transition to a clean Taiwan type future of Asia is going to require an enormous transition from. My sense is that what China has done is to look at what happened in the West. How did the West become rich? It became rich by burning a lot of coal, by developing an automobile industry, by doing all of those things. So China said, okay, we're going to do the same thing and we're going to do it faster. Okay? The problem is that it leads to a series of problems that require another change in the way in which you're going to run the future. And that's a hell of a challenge to make that change in a very short period. How long did it take the U.S. to clean up air quality, for example? We didn't do it in 10 years, you know. The EPA in 1970, made clean air standards, but we didn't really get there for 25 years or so, and we're still actually struggling with some of these things. So now we're asking China to do this in 10 years? I mean, this is a tough problem. It should not be understated.
Right. So forget the 10-year thing, but one has the sense that these global issues are not addressable unless the United States and China both lead in this effort. The United States being historically the great pollutant, China now having taken over that unenviable spot.
I'm strongly in favor of. I think that the way in which we've addressed the climate issue with every country in the world having an equal voice, essentially, is ineffective. I think we have to focus on the fact that it would be better to have a strongly coordinated bilateral approach between the U.S. and China to deal with these issues together. And I think that if we were able to do that, we would be addressing two types of problems. In the case of the U.S., we're addressing the problems that are posed by a mature energy economy. And in the case of China, we're addressing the problems that are posed by a developing energy economy. Different challenges, different opportunities. If we actually did this in a serious way, I think that that's the way in which we could actually bring that message to the rest of the world in a serious way. And I think the other thing I want to say is that it's really important to focus on the fact that, the London problem, the Denora, Pennsylvania problem, the Taiwan problem were local problems. Energy issues today are global issues. I mean, we're talking here in middle of June. What are we reading about in the newspapers? We're reading about today about the fact that the Russians are potentially going to turn off gas to Ukraine. We're reading about the fact that Europe may be on the downside of not getting gas from Russia that it depends on. I mean, the issues are global. I mean, what happens in one place affects what happens everywhere else. You know, the other story in the Chinese newspaper that I read this morning was that the price of oil has now spiked up to $109, $110 a barrel, largely because of the serious problems that are happening in Iraq, right?
Right.
But the fact that there is a problem in Iraq has implications for the consumer in China. I mean, the oil price in China will go up in response to what's happening in Iraq. So it's an interconnected world.